Ruben, it is great to see you. Let me ask you this, Ruben. So you're looking at the SMH here, so the ETF that tracks the chips. It's up about 70% as we round up 2023. Ruben, when you look ahead now to 2024, for chip investors who are listening, Ruben, what are the big bogeys, the big lessons you want to see in 2024? What's going to be the one big thing that's going to move this sector? And I don't mean to pigeonhole you. Maybe there's a couple, Ruben.
Yeah, hey, nice to see you here, Josh, on Yahoo. And thanks for having me. Yeah, it's a broad question, right? Semiconductor industry has a lot of moving parts and a lot of different types of companies that do a lot of different things. And you point out the SMH. A lot of the SMH move came from a handful of companies this year in 2023. One of the trends that we identified way back in January of this year, we do a trends report, was AI and a couple of the companies that we thought were going to benefit. And certainly Nvidia came out and starting with their earnings back in the spring, really started to surprise us. So we've seen that sort of flow through the Nvidia model. We think there's still plenty of room ahead. These semiconductor companies are now transitioning into not just being semiconductor companies. We think Nvidia is one of the first semiconductor companies that's cracked the code on becoming a software and services company. And so I think that's going to start to play in the model as you look out to 24. And if I had to, think about, some of these themes and trends that investors should be looking at, it's just that, what's next for AI? We've got these big capital investments from all of the big cloud service providers going into building out these massive training clusters. What happens next with the training clusters? How do you make an ROI on those investments? And I think that a lot of that is going to come back to, software services, moving this infrastructure and technology over to enterprise, customers. And I think we're going to start to see that play out. And certainly Nvidia, in our view, still screens as the best way to play that move. I think there'll be other companies that get involved. We like AMD, and we've talked about that in a few recent research reports. AMD had an AI specific analyst event a few weeks back and talked about their new hardware, but also, kind of this concept of AI being a three-pronged, technology approach for these companies, which includes networking, software, and the hardware itself. So I think, that's where investors should be looking. And I think AI is still going to be the big theme when we look ahead to 24.
I feel like so much of the conversation, Ruben, is around Nvidia and AMD for that matter. Are there some within the semiconductor space that are perhaps less well known that maybe investors should be looking to, particularly that can play that sort of 360 approach that you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's something that we've been doing a lot of work here, the tech team at Stifel, trying to figure out where the puck's going around AI, right? Because again, as I mentioned, these are tens of thousands of GPUs being built into big clusters, and there's networking aspects to it. But today, a lot of that networking is run by NVIDIA. If you look at NVIDIA's networking revenues, which, you compare that to a company like Broadcom that does networking chips, or a Marvell that does networking chips, NVIDIA all of a sudden is on a $10 billion annual run rate, which is networking, which really is a much smaller business for them, even a year ago. So when we start to think about what happens with AI networks and the rest of the data center, we look at companies that are involved in, putting the front ends of the networks in the data centers together, connecting data centers together, that are being built separately because there's just not enough power to power these data centers. So on that, kind of front, there are technology companies that we follow. Coherent is one that comes to mind. Lumentum. These are companies that are doing optical components, lasers, transceivers, and things like that live in the data center. So a little bit further along the food chain, but certainly I think there's a lot of revenue opportunity coming as the rest of these networks get built out again to monetize the big capital infrastructure spend that has happened for the training clusters thus far.
And Ruben, another theme, and I think you can bet it's going to play out in 2024 too, is just this increasing tension between Washington and Beijing, Ruben. It doesn't look like Washington wants to, limit the export of more mature tech, but they're certainly, of course, putting these export controls on more advanced chips. I'm just wondering, Ruben, for chip investors who are listening, how should they think about that tension? And does that disruption, Ruben, does it perhaps create opportunities for investors?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. So we cover Intel. We have a hold rating on Intel, but there's obviously a lot going on at Intel and a lot of interesting, positive, momentum at that company. We still think it's sort of a show don't tell story, but to the extent that, we think it's absolutely imperative for a lot of these companies that are very dependent on Taiwanese manufacturing and assembly plans to think about a reshoring or onshoring strategy. And to that end, Intel is putting together, kind of a massive strategy towards bringing back leading edge semiconductor manufacturing technology and infrastructure back to the United States. The issue is that this is going to take time, and these are very complicated technologies. There's a lot of moving parts in bringing in equipment and actually executing to these plans, and so a little bit longer term in nature. But investors should be watching that as well. If this were to go well, 2, 3, 4 years down the road, Intel is certainly one of the companies that stands to benefit if they are able to execute on their strategy. For our fabless design companies, we think it's absolutely going to be something that they'll have to consider. Again, will take some time. You flashed up a few of the design companies that we follow, Cadence and Synopsys. Our view is that those types of companies that are creating software and a lot of the tools at the front end of the design process are going to benefit, because they're sort of like arms dealers into sort of this overall manufacturing supply chain. And to the extent that we do have more manufacturers here in the United States, they are absolutely going to partner with those companies like an Intel or others. And so we think there are different ways to play it, and something that investors should keep an eye on. Again, it's going to take a little bit of longer term to play out on that front.
Ruben, it's always great to get some time with you. We really appreciate your insight and lots of good ideas going into 2024. Thanks again, and happy holidays.
Happy holidays to you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.